Good morning and vanakkam from the Tamil Nadu Science Center, or Science City, here in Chennai, India. My name is Kathleen Hosey. I'm the Information Officer at the U.S. Consulate General in Chennai, and I want to welcome our audiences here in Chennai, as well as in U.S. Embassy Delhi, U.S. Embassy Colombo. I want to thank our hosts here, Mr. Sangayam, Dr. Soundarajam Perumal, for hosting us today in the incredible Chennai Planetarium facility. And I want to thank also our audiences who are gathered in person at these three locations, as well as watching us online. This is a live stream program carried on the U.S. Embassy Delhi's Facebook page, as well as the U.S. Consulate General Chennai's Facebook page. It will be available after the event. There will also be an opportunity for Q&A after astronaut Dottie Metcalf-Lindberger's presentation. We'll be taking questions from the audience online as well as in person. The U.S. mission in India and to Sri Lanka is very excited about joining NASA this month to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Apollo program that landed a dozen Americans on the moon between 1969 and 1972. The Apollo missions captured the world's attention and demonstrated the power of America's vision and technology to inspire humankind to great achievements. Although the Apollo lunar flights ended in 1972, the moon has remained a great interest to NASA and scientists across the world, including here in India, where Indian Science Research Organization, ISRO, is launching its second lunar mission to the moon, named Chandrayaan-2. We are here to celebrate and cheer them on with that mission. We are going to the moon. We will return, says our NASA administrator. The U.S. is focused on sending both a man and a woman back to the moon in 2024, and thereafter to Mars and deep space. Today, it's such an exciting opportunity, even as an American citizen, to hear from a U.S. astronaut, Dorothy Metcalf-Lindberger. She is a geologist and a retired NASA astronaut. She has an incredible journey that I hope she will share today about going from being a science teacher in Vancouver, Washington, to being picked up for one of NASA's programs for astronaut or educators, and then traveling to space aboard the Discovery in 2010. Thereafter, she also commanded the NASA's Extreme Environment Mission Operations 16, an underwater habitat with an international crew of aquanauts. She is not just an astronaut, she's an aquanaut. And today she is speaking to us from her residence, where she is happily married and has a child, and continues to promote STEAM education around the world and inspire youth, even here in India today. So over to you, astronaut Dottie Metcalf-Lindberger.
Well, thank you so much, Kathleen. I really appreciate that. And it's an honor to be talking with three places across the world, in fact, many hours apart. And yet, I think we're all joined in the excitement of exploration and in the curiosity that it brings. And Simon, if you'll pull up the slides, we'll start there. So today, you were joining and daring to launch to space, and although the mission did not take off today, it will. And I want to remind people, and I hope today is a reminder, that space is very difficult. And we have setbacks all along the way. In fact, my own mission had originally was supposed to launch months earlier and was delayed because the mission before ours was delayed, which was delayed by other missions. So I think delays are wise, They allow time for us to fix or understand what wasn't operating. And that way we save the mission and we save the goals versus we have seen at NASA, if you proceed too quickly, there can be devastating results. And even the Apollo mission saw that with Apollo 1. So it's a reminder that space is very difficult. And to pursue it, whether with humans or with robots or with exploratory vehicles, is quite an undertaking. And it's an I hope that you, again, I said, have the curiosity and are reminded that this is a long duration mission that we're all on, which is to further understand our own Earth and our solar system. So we are celebrating how difficult it was 50 years ago. I mean, I think most of us were not alive. There are probably a few folks that are in the audience that were, and I bet they know what was happening during that time. But most of us, including myself, were not alive in 1969. And yet, we are inspired by what the Apollo 11 crew did, but not only the Apollo 11 crew, those Apollo missions that went before, and also the missions that came after until 1972. So my own parents were just in college. They just roughly started college when Apollo 11 happened. And it left such an impression on them that they talked about space, and they took me as a young girl to museums and to the planetarium to learn more about what was going on in space. And at the time, I was a little girl when I made this paper mache doll. It's 1983. A few things happened in 1983. One, the American woman Sally Ride first flew for us as the first American woman in space. Valentina Tereshkova had flown 20 years earlier. But as a little girl growing up in America, I did not know about her undertakings. I only knew about Sally Ride. And so, of course, my parents were talking about this. My parents were, at the time, my mom had retired from teaching, but she had been a math teacher. And my dad was working for Hewlett-Packard, but he had also been a science teacher at one time. So to both of them, this was a great accomplishment. Also in 1983, a movie came out that most of you probably haven't seen, but it's called The Right Stuff. It's about the Mercury astronauts, America's first men that flew in space. And I went with my parents to see this movie in the theater, and it captivated my attention, and it drew me into wanting to become an astronaut. So when my teacher asked, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" I made this paper mache doll because it was now possible for a little girl like myself to believe that I could be an astronaut. In any dream, you have to keep working hard towards your goals. So in middle school, I continued to study science and math, and I joined a club called MESA. In this club, my teacher, who's pictured in the front row on your right, Mr. Jordan, saw me as a scientist. This was important because I didn't even know if I saw myself as a scientist. But Mr. Jordan asked me to join him to explain a project that we were doing in our classroom, which was taking food waste and making it into ethanol to run his lawnmower. And so I spent a spring vacation traveling several states away on an airplane, which was a big deal to me, and going and talking to other students and teachers about how you can turn your food waste into a fuel that can run engines. And it taught me a lot about science, but it also helped me see that I really enjoyed being a scientist, because scientists solve problems together, and scientists get a chance to travel and talk to other people around the world. And this was my first experience in that. The following year, my parents sent me to Huntsville, Alabama, again, a few states away on an airplane to spend another spring vacation at space camp. This was in April of 1990. In April of 1990, the Space Shuttle Discovery was carrying the Hubble Space Telescope into space. We learned all about how shuttles operate. We learned about the Hubble Space Telescope and its pristine mirror and incredible optics. I met kids from around the United States and even around the world. We all were like-minded in that we were interested in space and that we were teenagers trying to figure out how we could get to space. It was an incredible week of simulations and even launching our own model rockets. And I came home, and next slide, I built this model of Discovery and I hung it in my bedroom as a reminder that this is my big goal. I would like to travel to space someday. But even if I can't go to space, I'd like to just be a part of NASA in solving difficult problems and helping others get there. Well, you can't just dream about it and build rockets, so I had to keep working in high school. This is a photo of me in a competition in high school, which is of course a science competition. I was in a club called Science Olympiad, where we spent our weekends solving challenging problems and competing against other schools in the state. And here we were taking second place. At the end of high school, I knew that I wanted to go and study in college and pursue science and math, but I also knew I wanted to keep running. In fact, I was a pretty good runner in high school, and I wanted to be able to do that at the collegiate level. Not as good as some athletes, so I wasn't going to be in a really challenging program, but I was going to be in a good program. So I found a perfect school for me in Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington. Whitman allowed me to study with only 1,400 other students and to find internship programs in the summer that took me out into the field as a geologist. So here you see me working in the left-hand picture outside of Yellowstone, mapping where the last big ice sheet had pushed into the mountains and carved away and left behind remnants. This really is truly summer, but as especially those in New Delhi know, but being near mountains, this can be what you get when you're up at 10,000, almost 11,000 feet, which is several thousand meters above sea level. So we had that snow. In the right-hand corner, I took that project and then went on to present it at other conferences, and I had other opportunities in college to do undergraduate research. Once again, I knew how much I love science, and I knew how much that I loved it because I was meeting new people, I was solving complicated problems, and I was enjoying myself. And that's what scientists get to do. Well, how did I become a teacher? Instead of going right into graduate school, I had a plan to be a part of Peace Corps and travel to Kazakhstan and teach English as a second language. But in 1997, when I was graduating from college, Kazakhstan pulled away from the Soviet Union. Well, at this time it was Russia was coming apart, and Peace Corps was not going to send me there. So the job I had lined up fell apart, but I didn't have graduate school lined up. So I was left not sure what to do. Then my mom and dad, both who had been teachers in high school, said, you know, if you were going to teach students in Kazakhstan, why don't you teach students in the United States? So that's what I ended up doing. I went back to school, next slide, and I became a high school science teacher. Here you see some of my students. My first few years, I taught only earth science, but many of my students were struggling and having a difficult time passing the subject. Not so much because it's hard, but because what was happening in their lives was hard. So several other teachers and myself created different programs to help them succeed and pass through high school. And I created an astronomy class because everyone is fascinated by space. It was in one of these classes that a student asked, "How do you go to the bathroom in space?" I think I was pretty embarrassed when they asked the question, but then I realized this is actually a pretty challenging engineering question. And so I went home and I looked up the answer on the internet, which took me to a NASA website, which had a nice description of how the space shuttle toilet worked, maybe even had a video. But more important for my life, it had a little ticker at the bottom of the screen that said that they would be hiring teachers as part of the next selection class of 2004. Holy cow! I was so excited. I went and told my husband, I have to apply for this. This is something I've been thinking about since I was a young girl. And now it's possible. Even though I didn't get to go to graduate school yet, there's a chance that I could become an astronaut because I've been serving as a teacher in our country. My husband, who is very practical, said, well, there's going to be a lot of talented people applying to that. And I agreed, I knew that. But how could I talk to my students every day and tell them to pursue their dreams if I didn't pursue my own? So I applied. And I'm going to tell you about the rest of that story, but I thought it might be a good chance now to just pause and see if anyone has any questions about these first few years of my life.
Kalama would like to ask a question, please.
Sure.
Hi, Astronaut Dorothy. I am Tishari Rajmohan, a student space ambassador of the Mars Generation mission.
Yes, I know all about the Mars generation.
Thank you. When we consider the 2017 astronaut class for NASA, consisting 12 astronauts who were selected from 18,300 applicants. NASA astronaut corps had a 0.065% chance of being selected. So, can you share us about the maximum qualifications an astronaut candidate should have if they want to pursue being an astronaut? And can you share us some possible tips to stand out the selection process of NASA?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, it was quite an incredible selection process. Can you imagine going from 18,000 down to 12? And we think part of this was due to the internet and social media, because prior to that, the classes weren't as, the folks applying were not as many, but social media wasn't around to announce these application processes. And so we think that part of that was due to social media. And how to become an astronaut, that's always everyone's question. And if you look at this class, they're quite a talented bunch of young people, but they're very reflective of many of the classes that have applied in the past. The biggest thing that we say is that you should be pursuing what interests you, and that you should be doing the best that you can in what you do. Now, there are minimum requirements. You do have to have a bachelor's in science or engineering or math and technology. But many of our applicants, of course, have master's or PhDs. Most of them have experience, and that's a big portion, is having experience. Even myself, I had 5 years of teaching experience before I was selected. And that experience allows you to have taken risks and have chances to perform leadership and to demonstrate your skills. Because to go to space, you need all of those qualifications. So this was a perfect question, because now in my slideshow, we're going to go into what happened at the selection process and how the first years of astronaut life are spent. So why don't we go back to the slides? Well, I told you I applied, and I had to wait over 6 months before I was called down to Johnson Space Center. But in the meantime, since I've now helped serve on selection committees, what happens? Well, for instance, you get those 18,000 applications, and then they're broken down amongst the astronauts and human resources, and they're looking to see, do you meet the minimum requirements? Because if you don't, we have to toss you out. And so the minimum requirements, like I said, you have to have that bachelor's, and it has to be in the fields of science and engineering or technology and math. And then you have to have experience. But I'm sure that that only limited it down to several thousand still. And then it becomes hard. We put people into experience piles. We have pilots, doctors, engineers, scientists specifically in geology, biology, microbiology, et cetera, et cetera. And so as astronauts, we go through and we read all of these applications, and we select out people that are that stand out because they've had experience doing leadership, putting themselves into positions of risk. For example, being a pilot, being a scuba diver, being a climber, a technical climber. These are all risky endeavors, but if you are a good one, you know how to limit risk. And so that's exactly what happens. I don't know, in the teaching pile, I may have stood out because I was an athlete, and I was a good athlete. And also I was good at my academics, and I had experience doing research in my undergraduate time, and I had experience leading my students. I even built a telescope by hand. So maybe some of those are the things that stood out. What finally got me down to Houston was being in that smaller selection group and being in good shape. You know, you have to be able to pass an FAA physical for our astronauts, which is the Federal Administrative Organization for Aircraft for Flying. And so I passed that, and I came down to Houston in a group of 35 other interviewees. Overall, they interviewed about 100 people during the time frame in 2004. And we went from, I think, 6,000 to 8,000 people down to this 100 that they interviewed, and then eventually 11 that they hired. Well, during my time in Houston for that week that I was interviewed, I went through many medical tests. I learned all about my body, my bone density, all my soft organs. I learned about more than anything about my heart. Did breathing tests, did running treadmill tests. Also, we did aptitude tests, both for spacewalks and for robotics. We did psychological tests. And finally, we got to do some tours. And this is a tour. Of course, the question that got me to even apply was, how do you go to the bathroom in space? And this is the shuttle toilet trainer. And so I had to take a picture for my students so I could take the answer back to them. Well, you know, I got hired. And this is that class of 11 American astronauts joined by 3 Japanese astronauts, Naoko Yamazaki, Satoshi, and Aki Hoshide. So the 14 of us were suddenly going off into our classes as being an astronaut. See, when you're first hired, you cannot immediately fly in space. So we were now going to train for a year and a half together before we could graduate and be able to be assigned as astronauts. Some of the training we do, first we go off and do survival training. This is in the state of Maine, where we were working under the Navy's SEER school, which is a survival, evasion, and resistance, but we just did the survival portion. And we broke into small teams, and we had to reunite and work out a scenario. So we learned how to survive in the wilderness. Of course, here we're doing some mapping skills, and eventually on the right, were doing an escape evacuation of one of our wounded. It was just a simulation. He wasn't really wounded, but we were evacuating one of our wounded crew members. At NASA, we do lots of simulations, and this is because if you've already thought about the worst case scenario, then you'll be prepared to attack that, but perform at the best case scenario. So this was a good initiation to our training. Then we went to Florida to the Naval Test Pilot School in Pensacola, where we did our water survival training. Now, oftentimes people ask me, what is their worst thing that happened during training? I have to say that this was my worst day because I was a high school swimmer and I love swimming, but I do not love drowning. And this felt like a day of almost forced drowning. But because we persevered and worked hard, it ended up being a rewarding day and a day that we learned that if you are calm and you think about what you need to accomplish to save your life, you can do it. So no matter how many times they drug us through the water or tipped us upside down, we all came out successful. After you do the survival and water survival training, you're now ready to start flying in a plane. We had a few of our classmates that were already pilots. Of course, they were military pilots, so they did not have to do this part of the training, but the rest of us had to. There were several doctors, engineers, teachers, and scientists that we all ended up doing the flight training. So on the left, we start out in simulators, and we learned how to do the navigation and flying portion and communication. And then on the right, I'm doing a pre-flight, learning about this prop plane and the systems that help run it. Well, as astronauts, we have the opportunity to fly in the T-38 jet, which is a training jet, about once a week, sometimes more frequently. This is because this aircraft helps prepare us for space. There's always a pilot in the front seat and a mission specialist in the back seat. It helps teach training, it helps teach preparation, pre-flighting a plane, plotting courses, and real-time risk situational awareness. We deal with weather, we deal with low fuel, we deal with engines, electrical systems, navigation, communication systems, and these are all very similar systems that are on any space vehicle. Specifically, we were flying the shuttle at the time, so it was very applicable to the shuttle. I loved flying in this vehicle. I'm not trained to be the pilot in the front seat, but of course I'm the mission specialist in the back. But that still means I can do all the flying from 200 feet to 200 feet. So I can do communication, navigation, and flying. And as I got better, I learned how to do rolls and all sorts of aerobatics. And I also learned how to do formation flying. It was a great vehicle to fly in, and it helped prepare us for space. Once we had done our initial flight training, now it was time to start learning about the space shuttle. Like I said, the space shuttle that you see the simulator on the left of your screen has all sorts of systems, navigation systems, communication, computers, engines, hydraulics, life support, robotic arms, and it can't all be done by one person. In fact, the first vehicle, Columbia, which was flown in 1981, was flown by 2 people. Since then, it has been flown by multiple people because we do multiple things in space and we need different team members to execute those mission critical steps. So each of us had to learn how to fly in the commander and pilot seat, even though we weren't going to necessarily fly there. Like I was never going to be the commander or pilot, but I had to learn how to do both of those seats. And that's so that we understand how our commander and pilot feel and are task saturated at different phases of flight. There are 1,500 switches and circuit breakers in the space shuttle. So I spent many weekends and evenings practicing and thinking and pulling the simulator up and working through sorts of problems so that I could have these scenarios worked out before being tested in front of my instructors. But it was rewarding testing, and we all passed. We also train in mock-ups. Mock-ups allow us to put on suits or bring along food or try all different types of things. It allows us to see how it would be in space. Finally, we did our robotic training. So on the left, I'm working in a virtual reality simulator to do my advanced robotic training. And on the right, that is actually a picture from me flying the robotic arm in space. And then we also did spacewalk training. So this is some of my favorite training because it is physically exhausting, and as a long distance runner, I like doing a lot of hard work. Also, you can see my daughter and my husband in this photo. I had my daughter after I had graduated from my initial training as an astronaut, but I was waiting to be assigned to a mission. You see, we had lost the space shuttle Columbia, and I know that India is especially touched by this because of one of the crew members on STS-107, KC. So while we tried to understand why that shuttle burned up on its re-entry, many of us were waiting to fly in space. And while we were waiting, I had my daughter, who is now 12 years old. But in this picture, I think she's 4 or 5 months old. So spacewalk training is very rewarding, and it's also a lot of hard work. You're in these suits that you see on the right. They're bulky, they're heavy, they're hard on your shoulders. You don't have full vision because it's cut off by the helmet view. Your arms can't stretch as far, they're limited by joints. And so you have to think about how to work together and how to work with the tools that you have. But spacewalks are what helped us build the International Space Station. And in Apollo, spacewalks are what returned all those great lunar rocks and helped us understand the lunar surface. So it's great training. Okay, so from being hired to being assigned as a crew member, that took about 5.5 years. The first 1.5 years, like I said, we're sort of in a astronaut school, and you can't be assigned to flight if you don't pass. Then once you pass, you're training, you fly in the T-38, you do simulations, you learn Russian language, you go to more advanced training for spacewalk and robotic arm training. Some of that is in Canada, or now for new astronauts, in fact, they're traveling around the world to do their International Space Station training. So there's lots to be done in those years that you're waiting to be assigned a flight. Plus, you have a job for the office, and often that job is to help make sure that the crew members in space are being taken care of. So I worked on computer systems for our astronauts. I also worked on helping getting food and clothing and all sorts of logistical items to space, helped make sure payloads made sense to our astronauts. So now might be another good time to take a break and ask if students or if audience members have questions about astronaut training.
We have a question in Chennai.
Go ahead.
Hi. I want to ask what exactly goes on in this water survival training?
At the survival training? Yes.
The water survival training.
Oh, the water survival. Well, we did a lot of things. That first video you saw, we were strapped into a helicopter, a simulated helicopter body, and dunked into the water. It has to roll over, and then you have to escape. The first time, you can go out any window or door, but you have to wait till it rolls over because of the rotary blades. The second time, you're assigned to a specific window or door to go out. And the third time, you have to do in dark out goggles to simulate being in night or to distraction, or, you know, there's a lot of bubbles and stuff, so you just have dark out goggles. Some of the other things you saw us being dragged through the water. That's as if your parachute is dragging you. Your parachute could drown you if it captures too much water. And so you have to eject out of your parachute, and then you have to inflate the life raft, which is in your seat pad. You inflate it, and then we practice like signaling planes with mirrors. We have little drink bags in the survival kit of the plane, fishing hooks. So thinking about what you would do if you were left at sea for a long period of time. We also, in a previous day, and a day earlier to that day that you saw the video, we also had some big life rafts that we all got in together and had to practice rescuing each other, pulling people out of the water, etc. Treading water, we had to tread water for 10 minutes without any help in our full gear and boots, which is kind of heavy. But as a swimmer, you know, it's also very doable. If you do a real gradual tread of water and just stay calm, it's really not that hard. But it could be hard for people if they panicked. So those are some of the things that we did at water survival training.
And hey, Kathleen, we have a question here in Delhi really quickly as well.
I'm Prishra and I'm from Presidium School. I'd like to ask a question. You stated that Kalpana Chawla, when she went for the Columbia mission, then all the crew members had passed away. So did that affect, like, did it create a sense of nervousness for your mission, since it was just after that? So did that affect how your mission was going to be successful or not?
So Casey's flight was actually prior to when I applied as an astronaut. We lost Columbia in 2003, and I applied a month later to be an astronaut. And I knew about this loss of the vehicle. I was very saddened by the STS-107. But as a young girl, I also saw the loss of the Challenger flight. And both remind us, like I said, space is very difficult. But I have lost other friends in, you know, in tragedies or in just things that are everyday happenings. And I think it's also a reminder that our lives are short, but they can be well lived. I think that Casey and the 107 crew all were doing things that they loved and that they believed in. They were doing incredible science. It was biology, like their mission was all about medical science and biological sciences. And so they were making incredible advancements. And most of that survived because it was downlinked through video. Not all, but most survived. And so I think it's a reminder that life is short and that we should live our lives to the fullest every day, no matter what we're doing. And I think that crew definitely did. So yes, it did change a lot of things. We stopped flying vehicles for about 2 years, I think. We had a stand down, and as we tried to understand why a piece of foam could take down a space shuttle and how we could stop that from happening. And it caused all of the centers across the United States, from Johnson Space Center, Kennedy, Langley, all of Glenn, all these centers were doing research on how to make the space shuttle less risky to the following missions.
Hi ma'am, this is Bharadwaj from MIT. I have a question about re-entry. So what kind of training is being given to withstand such high forces during re-entry?
And so during re-entry, what type of training do we do?
Yeah, what kind of training is being given to withstand such high forces during re-entry?
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing about the re-entry and its design is that we as crew members do not experience high forces, but the vehicle experiences heat and the heating up as it comes back through the atmosphere. So we have a motion simulator and we do most of our training there. Really, we have two other trainers that we use. We have a shuttle training aircraft, but that really only simulates the last this is like maybe the last minute of flight on the heading alignment. So by then you've already, the highest forces that we achieve during re-entry is about 2.1 G. It's not very much, really. It feels like a lot when you have been in microgravity and then to come back, but it's really not that much. So we have a shuttle training aircraft that helps the pilots and commander practice these landings. Since it's a glider and it can't relight engines, they practice in that aircraft from 18,000 feet to a simulated landing. And they have to have, to be a commander, you have to have 1,000 attempts. And to be a pilot, you have to have 500. So they have done multiple trainings. And I got to participate in these as the flight engineer. Although I don't fly the aircraft, I join them to understand what's going on. Also, we have another simulator in California that really only it only simulates the last little bit on the heading alignment cone. It's more designed for if there were winds, so you're low down in the atmosphere, if there are winds as you're coming in, or if you're on the runway and you blow a tire, which could cause you to veer off, and how to not overreact to that. So it's designed for that. But really, most of it is done in a motion simulator. We spend 4 hours in that at a time, practicing ascents and entries, sometimes just entries. Yeah, that's how we practice.
We have one other quick question on the training component here in New Delhi.
Great.
Yeah, hi, I'm Utsav Bhardwaj from Tears of the Earth organization. I just wanted to ask you that the wilderness survival training which you did, how relevant was that in the actual scenarios? Because what I believe, the actual scenarios must be quite different rather than what you experienced in the wilderness.
Right. Well, in all likelihood, with nowadays, with global positioning systems on board all of our aircraft, and the United States being so heavily populated, and that's where we're flying, is across the United States, it's probably unlikely that we would have to go into a survival state. But at NASA, we do a lot of things because of tradition and also to build team cohesiveness. So tradition, Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, early shuttle, they all did survival training. So of course we did survival training. It's tradition. And then also cohesiveness of teams. This is a great way to start getting to know each other in an uncomfortable situation. Space is not always comfortable. And we're, from the very first day, we're being taken care of by by astronauts in classes above us. So they're watching. They want to see that we're going to be successful. And if they see us struggle in situations that aren't very challenging, like where we're learning, if they start to see us struggle there, they want to jump in right away and put in some measures to help us be more successful, because things are going to get a lot harder. So in reality, we use survival training just to help us think through risky situations and start building teamwork and start building team cohesivity. And also to think about the past, right? Like, it was fun to think about how other astronauts from the past had also done survival training. Well, I think we'll go back to the presentation, and then we'll, I'll let you guys ask some more questions at the end of the presentation as well. So save your questions. Okay, so I was assigned to the flight of STS-131, which I feel very fortunate. It was a great crew. Our commander was Alan Poindexter from the Navy. He had already flown in space as a pilot that brought up the Columbus module to the International Space Station. Our pilot was my classmate, Jim Dutton, and Jim and I have a lot of things in common because we have spent great amounts of time in the same states, and we have family members in the same states. So he grew up in Oregon. My husband was born in Oregon, and he went to school at the University of Washington, where I went to school in Washington, and eventually would go to the UW for my master's degree. And he went to the Air Force Academy in Colorado, which is where I grew up as a young girl. So the two of us spent a lot of time looking for the Washington and Oregon and Colorado on our flight. My other crewmates, Rick Mastracchio, had already flown twice in space. Stephanie Wilson, she had also flown twice in space. And Clay Anderson, he had lived on the space station for over 3 months. Naoko Yamazaki was my other classmate, and so Jim, Naoko, and I were the 3 space rookies. And that, of course, they like to give you a hard time as the new people going to space, but it was fun to share it with my classmates. So after a 1.5 years of training together, which is a lot of the same activities that we did in our initial astronaut candidacy training, but just more flight specific. On April 5th of 2010, almost 20 years to the day that I had gone to space camp in Huntsville, Alabama, and built the model of Discovery, I flew on the Space Shuttle Discovery. I hope it reiterates that in our lives, we pursue things that are hard and challenging. We take different twists and turns in our career moves, and it doesn't always look like things are working out, but sometimes they do. And for me, on April 5th, that was one of those days. Our first day in space, one of the things that we learned from losing STS-107 was that we wanted to check out our tiles and wing leading edge of our vehicle. So to do that, we use an extension of the robotic arm that you see on the left side of the screen. And we use it, which has a camera package at the end, and we take photos of all of the wing leading edge and tiles and send them back to engineers on the ground who spend hours and run computer programs to detect any flaws that could cause a problem like we saw on 107. So one of my jobs in space was to fly the robotic arm. And it's awesome to fly the robotic arm. It's very similar to flying the airplane, only instead of having a throttle in your left hand and a stick in your right, you have a translator in your left hand and a roll, pitch, and yaw in your right. But you have to think of it very similarly. Our shuttle brought up that silver module you see in the back, which had 27,000 tons of equipment. I'm sorry, 27,000 pounds, 6 tons of equipment roughly. And some of that's obviously packaging and vehicle volume. And then behind it, it looks small, looks like a small little rectangle, but behind that module is the ammonia tank that we brought to change out on the space station. When we docked on the space station, it just happened that we set a record by having 4 women in space. This is the most women that have flown in space together. Hopefully that will be broken very soon as we start sending more women to the International Space Station or when we go to the moon. But here you see in maroon my friend Tracy Caldwell Dyson, who was living on the space station, and then of course Naoko and Stephanie and myself. Stephanie and Naoko used the International Space Station's robotic arm, which is different than the space shuttle arm because it can actually walk itself across the space station. It can have a fixed shoulder, but then it has joints that can move it, and it can pick up another base and then let go and move itself. So they use that robotic arm to take that silver module, the multi-purpose logistics module, out of our payload bay and berth it to the space station. And then we became space movers. We had to get all of that equipment unloaded and over to the space station, but we also had to pick up trash. And in space, this becomes complicated because you can't set things down. Otherwise, they'll float away. So you can see bungees in the back and lots of buckles and straps. We use all of those things to help make this possible. But it's pretty fun to be a space mover. Here I'm delivering food, food boxes that are, I don't know, vegetables or meats or something to the International Space Station. We did have 3 spacewalks during our mission. Rick and Clay were our spacewalkers. Here, they're getting ready in the airlock. They're getting their suits prepared, and they're also looking through their tools to make sure they have everything ready. On a spacewalk day, it is very busy on the space station. We all wake up early. Jim, our pilot, helped get Clay and Rick into their spacesuits and get the oxygen pre-breathe process going with them. And then my job was to help get all their tools on them, help Jim get them in the airlock, and then I took over and I was in charge of talking to them for the next 6.5 to 7 hours as their backup member. So I didn't do a spacewalk, but I was their backup crew member, and I knew all the details about their spacewalk. So here I am at work. I've got all sorts of checklists to make sure that they are safe, to make sure they're doing the next steps and on the right call, and also to make sure that we're coordinating with our robotic arm operators, who happen to be Jim and Stephanie, and with the ground, the Houston Mission Control Center, and then also with the larger other teams. I always laugh that we call it a spacewalk when really it's more like a space handstand, because you use your hands to hold those rails for all 6.5 to 7 hours. As you can see, coming from the left side of the screen is the safety tether. That's the very first thing we have an astronaut put down when they exit the vehicle. It has a large hook that connects them to the vehicle and obviously connects into their suit. We have multiple space safety tethers so that they can move down the space station at greater distances. But just in case the safety tether were to ever break, the outer backpack of the suit does have nitrogen in little jets that they could use a hand controller and propel themselves back to the station. Thankfully, we've never had to use that for an actual emergency. It has been used to test out in space, but not for a real emergency. Here are Stephanie and Jim. They're working at the robotic workstation. You can see they have multiple screens around them. This helps provide them camera views so they protect from hitting the elbow on any of the robotic arm on any part of the space station, as well as the end effector. It also allows them to have checklists and communication with myself, because I'm the intermediary between them and the spacewalkers. And then I can join them up to talk directly to each other when they need to for tight maneuvers where it's much easier for the spacewalker to talk to the robotic arm operators. I always like this slide. First of all, take a moment and see if you can find the spacewalkers. Now, if you found them, they're close to the ammonia tank, and they're a little bit close to the space shuttle's robotic, or I'm sorry, to the space station's robotic arm. The space shuttle's robotic arm is way off on the right-hand side, providing camera views. I like this picture because it shows a large team, although you may not see all of that team. It shows Rick and Clay outside. Stephanie and Jim are working on the robotic arm. I'm talking to all of them. But down on Earth is Mission Control. And Mission Control is watching all of us and helping us execute this, because our mission, as well as many others, have come into snags. During our mission, we were trying to get the new ammonia tank into place, but it wouldn't set against the space station truss. It warped because of the difference between cold and hot temperatures in the light and dark. And so it wasn't settling and the bolts weren't driving. So Mission Control helped us work out a plan, which ended up taking longer than expected, which meant our third spacewalk was completely changed. So like in anything you do, many times the real heroes are not the people you see, but the people that are unpictured in the picture, the people that are spending hours around the clock helping you solve problems and make everything work out right. Okay, this is just a zoom in so that you can see that ammonia tank in motion, and you can see the spacewalkers right next to the arm. This is my favorite picture that I took while I was on the mission. As you can see, it's of course got our spacewalkers attached to the bottom of the truss of the International Space Station, which has been over the Earth at this point for 10 years, but now over 20 years today. But really, the space station that all of us live on is pictured there too, and that's Spaceship Earth, with that very thin atmosphere that we must all protect and take care of. So I like this as a reminder that 13 people can live on the International Space Station at one time, but billions of us live on Spaceship Earth, but we must take care of it just as diligently as astronauts. Once we get our crew members back inside, we want to get them out of their suits and get them food. They have been without food for several hours, sometimes 8 or more hours. They have had water because they have a drink bag in the front of the suit with a little bite valve that they can drink out of, but that's it. So they are tired and they are hungry and thirsty. But to get them out of the suits, we literally have to attach them to the wall so that we can jerk on their lower torso and pull the pants off, and also, you know, undo the helmets and undo the gloves. So we've attached Rick and Clay to the walls, and we're ready to get them out of their suits. And of course, when you're in space, there are many moments that you want to look back at Earth, and that's where astronauts spend a lot of their time, is pressed up against a window, looking back at Earth, looking at views that we have seen and have not ever seen before. And it's just fascinating and beautiful. Next slide. Those brand new sunrises, the auroras, the stars, the Milky Way, it's incredible views every time. This is one of my favorite pictures that we took, or actually that our commander took, of the Milky Way. I think it's like a 2 or 3 second time delay that allows us to capture the colors of the stars and of the Milky Way and see the Earth moving below us. We enjoy having meals together. This particular meal, Naoko and Satoshi made us, Suichi, Noguchi, Naoko and Suichi made us sushi in space. But we also were able to have an American meal and a Russian meal while we were there. And just like here on Earth, having a meal together is a great way to appreciate each other, to spend time talking and discussing the day and our backgrounds and our futures. Next slide. When we go to space, we're allowed to take some pictures and mementos with us. So of course, I took pictures of my husband and daughter with me to space. Astronauts have to work out in space. They spend, well, now on the space station, they spend about 2 hours a day working out. For me, on the space shuttle, I only spent about 45 minutes to an hour every other day. But this is because our heart atrophies, as well as our large leg muscles, which put loads on our bones. And we need those loads so that we don't lose bone density. So we work out in space. People have enjoyed growing plants and bringing different creatures to space to learn about how they are similar and very different in space. Well, after spending 11 days docked to the International Space Station, it was time for us to come home. So Jim Dutton, our pilot, is putting in some pulses on our jets with his hand controller, and he's bringing us away from the space station. Then we make a loop around the International Space Station before we start to descend away and pull away. But here again, as we were in space in April, when we passed across the Northern Hemisphere, we would look back at Earth and see a lot of snow-covered land. We landed on April 21st, 15 days later after taking off, and it was a wonderful, wonderful trip. And actually, sorry, it was April 20th because it was 15 days. Here we're landing on runway 33, and as you can see, the glider has come down to Florida. So the chute comes out. That helps, especially in the past, reduce the load on the tires, allowing them to be used more often, but it just helps slow the vehicle in general. And it's ejected before we come to a full stop. And I think actually I'm going to end the talk here. I do have slides about NEMO, but I think based on our time, I'd really just like to open it up to the group. And NEMO is something that you can always check out on the internet. But I'd like to do questions from the group now.
And I have a question here. In fact, it's been observed that the space station actually travels at several thousand kilometers.
Mm-hmm. I can hear you.
The space station travels at several thousand kilometers per hour. So how do you ensure that the docking of the space shuttle is done properly? Because even the slightest issue there might result in the space station veering off course.
Yeah. Yes, so that's true. We are traveling at several kilometers very quickly, but relative to each other, the space station and the space shuttle relative to each other are only traveling a short amount at a time. It's very slow as they approach. But to people on the ground, of course, we're going 17,500 miles per hour, or I think it's 28,000 kilometers per hour. So it's very fast, but relative, it's slow. In the last, probably the last about 30 meters are very, very slow, very slow.
One more question from Shania, then we'll move to Delhi.
Okay, hi. So now I want to ask a question about, the Apollo 11. The question is that it is said that Neil Armstrong actually left a seismograph on the surface of the moon so that he could measure the depth of the moon, like totally. And then when the last stage of the Apollo, while taking off from the surface of the moon, when it dropped, he thought he could measure it. But what actually happened is, once it hit, there was a huge signal that kept transmitting again and again and again. Why did that actually happen?
Wow, you've got a question that I haven't ever read about. I didn't know about this, so I'll have to go look it up, just like I had to look up my question from my student about going to the bathroom in space. I hadn't heard about this particular thing.
Thanks. Over to Delhi.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, we have a whole bunch of questions here in Delhi. I think we'll start with this young lady right here.
Hello, ma'am. My name is Mahi, and I'm from GD Goenka. My question is, how does the extreme climate change that is happening on the Earth right now affect the travels up in the space?
Yes. Well, what we know is that many of our centers that we launch from are on coastlines, and if we're not careful and not thinking about the strategies that we need to be taking to curb our greenhouse gases, these centers will keep seeing seawater encroach upon them. So we're seeing that in Florida. I'm sure that you're seeing it also in India as well, that the sea level is rising and that it's coming in on our centers. As well as for us in Florida, we have hurricanes that come, and the surges of the water can be quite dangerous as well. So having our launch facilities there, that also poses another problem to have these extreme storms. Also, what we're seeing is that our control center in Houston, while it does have floodgates, has had to close more frequently because of hurricanes and large storms and flooding. We can't put people at risk by asking them to work when their families must evacuate. And so we've had to hand off to places like Marshall Space Flight Center or the European Space Agency or to the Russian Space Agency. So it's good that we have backup systems, but we also have to see that it's causing problems for not only our launch facilities, but just the citizens of our countries as well.
And we have one last question here live from Delhi. And then we also have a couple coming in on the Facebook page, but we can take those whenever. So here's another question live.
I'm Divyanshu. I wanted to ask you that after you had completed your training, you had to wait 5.5 years to be assigned on a mission. So basically, what did you do in that time? How does NASA assign people to missions?
Well, we had a long line of astronauts already waiting to fly in space, and they had been waiting assigned to cruise, but just waiting as we had this stand down on flight. So the new astronauts, those of us that were in my class, we, like I said, we did more advanced training. You got to do more spacewalk training in the pool. We did more language training, learning the Russian language. We got the opportunities to live over in Russia for short periods of time so we could practice our language. We did more robotic training. We supported other flights. So we'd fly to Florida, support families and other crew members, check out their gear, help set up their vehicle. And then we kept training in the T-38 jet. And, you know, you have to practice like any instrument, or if you're a vocalist or anything, you have to keep practicing over and over if you're going to be good at something. So we practiced in simulators.
So, Aston Doty, we have a question from Colombo, from our youngest audience. So I think he has skipped school today to attend your talk. Here he goes.
My name is Ramitu, and my question is, are astronauts aware and are they always notified about any incoming space debris, and also microasteroids are a huge problem as they can be parts of the space suit, and that could be a major risk. And how are the astronauts made aware of this condition?
Yes, so large pieces of debris are tracked in the United States, and oftentimes we already know well in advance like what we need to do to the space station to move it. So we can actually increase the altitude of the space station using the Russian jets or using a vehicle that's visiting. Oftentimes we'll use their additional propellant to lift the vehicle higher before that vehicle leaves. So we can do that. But sometimes there are pieces of debris that are so small that we don't know about them until the last minute. Then we have astronauts shelter in the Soyuz vehicle, their escape vehicle, in case they need to leave. The good news about the space station now is it's so big, it has so much air, right? So early on, when it was a smaller space station, if you had a micrometeorite hit, you could lose your atmosphere very quickly. Now it's big, you have a lot of volume, and you have hatches. You can shut hatches that could isolate the leak. So there's a whole procedure that you can do if something like this happened. And we even have ways to patch hits that can happen in the vehicle and have happened where we've patched these problems. Yes, but we are able, even with small things usually, to detect it. One of the things my crew members, I had to let Clay and Rick know when they were out doing their spacewalk, we had to check their gloves to make sure that the micrometeorites that hit the handrails do not cut their gloves, because of course little paint chips and even little pieces of dust can cause little divots that are very sharp in the metal that they're touching. So those are the ways that we deal with that.
Thank you. And for the second question.
This is Sarah, aspiring astronaut and the student space ambassador for the Mars generation. I have a question that how can the astronauts feel the taste of food in space? How the taste buds works in space?
Well, as you probably know, taste involves smell, and smell usually works because we have currents of air that are drifting that smell towards our nose. But in space, the currents of air might not be going that direction, or we may not smell things the same way. So sometimes people think that things taste differently in space. Despite how much salt we use in our foods to preserve them, to take it to space, people still often want more salt or spices. To protect their health, especially their bone health, we recommend not using more salt, but maybe like we fly tubes of garlic or basil or hot sauces, curries. These things make things taste more interesting without using sodium, which helps, sodium can take away some of our bone density because of the exchange of the chemical in our blood. So important not to use salt, but obviously people want to have food and taste it and have it taste good. So using other spices helps to make it taste good in space.
Okay, and then back here in Delhi, we're also monitoring the questions that are coming in on Facebook Live. So one question that was coming in, seems we have a lot of students here who are engaged in the Mars generation. What do you think is more critical right now in terms of establishing a base is one of the questions, going back to the moon or going right to Mars?
You know, I have always thought going to the moon again would be important because it's closer by and space is very challenging. And there's a lot of things that we need to work out before going to Mars. So by going to the moon, we can think about how to set up a communication system around the moon so that we could keep communication, mapping, right? We would want to be able to map, but usually you need satellites in position around the body, the planet, or in this case, the moon, so that you can have those mapping capabilities and orientation capabilities. You want to be able to build things. How can you use the lunar surface, which is going to be similar to the Martian surface? How can you use the very surface itself to provide your building materials, creating the atmosphere, planting things? All these are questions that we have, but if you're only 3 days away versus 6 to 9 months away, that's a lot bigger difference. And knowing that you have already returned back multiple times, that also matters, versus we've never returned back from Mars with even an exploratory mission, right? Like a return sample. So that's a huge thing that would need to be accomplished and requires great amounts of fuel and a special vehicle to be designed. But we know that we can do it from the lunar surface. So I think returning to the moon is a great next step, a very critical step, and it gives us the chance to start answering these important questions before heading off to Mars, which I also find very interesting and want to go see as well. But I think it's, safer and helps us get there in a step-by-step motion versus making a leap that could be really super risky, or just not making the leap at all because it takes so much money and we just decide that we're not ready.
Back to Chennai.
Hello. It was really an incredible journey. I would request Chennai audience to give a big applause before that.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
So my question is not technical. My question is, I know that you are a God-fearing person, especially after having gone to space. And also your experience with other astronauts in the US. I'm putting this in context because what we see here in India is not directors. Every time we have a launch, we take models of the space vehicles to the temples. Dr. Radhakrishnan did that before Chandrayaan-1. So Dr. Sivan also did that again. Well, I want to know whether US astronauts also take models to the churches for prayers. And science and religion. Are you people religious? Do you believe in science? Especially after having explored space. Right? Do you still think God is there?
Oh yes, I'm a very spiritual person as well. I don't know if that, like, I personally am a Christian, but I don't know that I have the right answer. I think there can be many ways that we approach God, but I think when I went to space and just saw the beauty, grandeur, the just, all I had seen about space was in pictures, but what pictures have edges, right? They stop, they end, but space doesn't. And when you're there, you have this very big sense of the feeling of being so small in this vastness of beauty and just an enormous solar system and then universe. So I think there has to be something that created us, and how we come to that, I am not to judge. I come in my way, and I think it's okay for others to come in their way, that there doesn't have to be one answer, but I definitely believe in a higher being. And I think that by understanding that, then also I understand in ways that that there's a need to be connected to each other and to follow a golden rule, do unto others as you would want done to you. So coming back to Earth, I think it's very important to make sure that I take care of the Earth, because my actions would hopefully take care of my brothers and sisters around the world. And as a mom and as a wife and as someone who is a family member, I would want others to know that I would take care of their families and care and am compassionate about them and see them as equals and as people that deserve to have their voices heard. So yeah, I'm a very spiritual person, and this was many moments in the journey. I took time to give thanks to God and also to be thankful, grateful to the people that were my parents who taught me, my teachers, and then just to wonder, you know, at the things I can't even conceive. Yes.
Okay, and here in Delhi, we had a question about going into space and the private-public partnerships.
Yeah.
Oh, here he is.
Hello, my name is Jan from ASN Senior Secondary School. What are the applications of the reusable rockets that are being made by SpaceX?
Yeah, and it's not just SpaceX that's doing reusable, it's also Blue Origin and other companies are looking at that. And the reason is because it's very expensive to make any space equipment. And so if you can have portions that are reusable, then you're able to not have to build more, but also to save money and resources. So I think from an environmental standpoint, although spaceflight does have a lot of impacts on the environment, but minimal compared to the gains we make and advancements of understanding. So yeah, I think it's very impressive, right, to see these things return back and land perfectly on their landing spots. That's just incredible. But two, from the standpoint of being able to reuse that equipment and not have to create it or use other resources.
Ma'am, when the space shuttle is going outside the Earth's gravity, that is, it is escaping the Earth's gravity and going to Mars or some other thing, how it will come back to the Earth by attaching itself to the gravity? What is the process going on? Once it escapes the gravity, how it is coming back to the Earth? Can you explain that more?
Yes. So technically, we never leave Earth's gravity, right? So when we're on the space shuttle, we're free falling around the Earth in an orbit. But really that orbit is decaying. And if we can't go on and on forever, we're starting to slow down into the Earth's atmosphere. It's a short mission, so we do minimal burns and it keeps that circular. What we do to return home and slow down, but we've always been using gravity in this free fall, what we do is we do our burn into the velocity. So we put the engines into that velocity vector, that slows us down, then we flip the vehicle around and we start to make these S-turns back through the Earth's atmosphere. And this takes 30-some minutes while we're making these big turns to the atmosphere. And essentially we're falling a lot in altitude, but we're also getting long range as we're making these turns, and that slows us down. And then, and that whole time we've been in Earth's gravity. And we just haven't been feeling it because the free fall makes it feel like you're floating, but you've been experiencing gravity. That's what's been keeping the vehicle going. And then how we come into the actual landing is once we've slowed down enough and there's enough air around us, we can work as a glider, which is a lot like a kite, right? Just a very fast kite in this case. And we're gliding on that atmosphere and we use it to bring us into landing.
We got a question from Colombo.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sandali. I'm one of the student space ambassador for the Mars Generation, and I recently attended the space camp, the Advanced Space Academy. And
congratulations, that's exciting.
Thank you. Ma'am, I want to receive an advice for the young generation in Sri Lanka to pursue their dreams in the space science field. I would like, yeah, I would like to receive an advice for the younger generation.
Yeah.
In Sri Lanka, who is pursuing their dreams towards this space science field.
So yes. So my advice would be to continue working hard, studying math and science and engineering, to look at programs both like international programs that are through governments, but then also look at the private companies and think about which direction that you would want to go. If you go to a private company, your space mission might be shorter, right? Maybe just a few minutes, maybe longer. Some of these companies are looking at flying to the moon or beyond. So it could be longer, but currently, since they haven't flown yet, it's going to look like it's going to be shorter missions. Or, get your foot in and be an engineer for them, help them build their vehicles. Maybe be a designer for Sri Lanka and start your space program. If you're going through an international government program, then it is a different route, because currently it has to be, of course, through countries that are participating in the International Space Station. So it's convincing folks that you want to put enough money behind and start adding to the human spaceflight portion. Either way, it's not impossible. It's going to be challenging, and anything that's worthwhile doing is often challenging. So I would say keep working hard, set those goals high, and think about creative ways to participate.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was an honor to have this chat with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Dottie, on behalf of audiences viewing your presentation here in Chennai, Delhi, and Colombo, I want to thank you for your inspiring words and being such a role model for all of us. If I could ask everyone to give her another round of applause.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. I'm so honored. Thank you.
If you have parting words.
I just want to say thank you. And as we celebrate this week of 50 years in the past, let's also think forward. Where will we be in 50 years? More specifically, where will you be in 50 years? Thank you all for inviting me into your day to celebrate, and I wish you the best.
Thank you, Dottie. Have a good night, a good rest, and an exciting week commemorating the Apollo 11 moon landing.
Thank you. Bye, you guys. Thank you.